Ladies and gentlemen, in the interest of air safety and your own personal safety, we ask that you keep a close watch on your carry-ons and personal belongings.
Welcome to the AeroExploration Podcast, where aviation's past, present, and future meet. We explore the stories that build aviation history, take you inside the industry today, and uncover the career paths and innovations keeping the industry in motion. We go behind the scenes, into the cockpit, and onto the ramp, meeting the people and discovering the places that define aviation. If it's part of the flying world, you'll find it here. This is AeroExploration.
Welcome back, everyone, to the AeroExploration Podcast. My name is Jim, and I'm your host. And on this episode, we're going to take the podcast in a little bit of a different direction than you may be used to from listening to my podcasts. So this time around, we're going to tackle a moment in aviation history. And this is a big one. For those of us who were alive at the time, this is going to be one of the most impactful moments of our lifetimes, both in aviation as well as the magnitude of the event itself. That's right, I'm talking about September 11th, 2001. And on this episode, we're going to talk about the huge impact that didn't just have on our country itself, but on the aviation industry and those who were serving in it at the time. So those of us who are old enough to remember will never forget where we were on the morning of September 11th, 2001. I know for me personally, I was on an active duty Air Force base, celebrating my 1-year anniversary of service in the United States Air Force. What would happen in the days to follow was just completely surreal and probably a topic for a completely separate episode. But one of the things I distinctly remember as I worked night shifts on our flight line was the only planes in the air belonged to our base. It was a calm in the skies that I have never seen before and I haven't seen since. And it's something that I will never forget. But the aircraft that were up there were in direct support of protecting our country from any possible additional attacks. But before that Tuesday morning, for many American airlines, they were living in the final moments of a bygone era of aviation. Now, it wasn't exactly the golden age of the 1950s or 60s where you had fancy meals and roomy cabins, and flying was really a luxury that was just reserved for people who could afford to do it. The whole period was a product of a heavy government regulation which controlled routes and prices, and it was guaranteeing profits and protecting airlines from real competition. The industry in 2000 was a child of deregulation. See, back in 1978, the government had stepped back and unleashed a storm of competition amongst all of these airlines. And this was really great for us as passengers, though I didn't get to really reap the benefits of it because I'm not that old. It had led to lower fares and made flying accessible to pretty much anyone. And there'd be a lot of family and business travel that would come as part of that. But it also created a brutal and cutthroat world for the airlines itself. But still, the major legacy carriers like your United, American, Delta, and U.S. Airways, they remained stable for the most part. If you've flown one of these airlines, I'm sure you've experienced this, but they are based on a huge hub and spoke network. So take your major hubs, your Denvers, Atlanta, even Minneapolis to an extent, amongst others. And they were able to build a network and create a powerful brand name for themselves. And most importantly, the business travelers would pay premium fares without blinking to fly on their airlines. So for hundreds of thousands of pilots, flight attendants, and mechanics, a career in a major airline was still a ticket to the middle class, complete with job security and a promise of a solid pension at the end. Some deep cracks were starting to form in the industry itself. The dot-com bubble had just burst and it was kicking off this mild recession that started to hurt travel demands. Even more threatening is the industry was completely changing how people bought their airline tickets. So suddenly, anyone could hunt for the absolute cheapest fare with just a few clicks of a mouse. Now add to that a new kind of airline was ready to exploit this new reality, and you came up with some low-cost carrier airlines like Southwest, Sun Country, and they were rewriting the rules with their direct routes, single-class cabins, and hyper-efficient operations. So with that, the old school legacy carriers with their higher labor costs and complex networks just couldn't compete with those prices. To make things worse for one airline, American Airlines had just gone through a messy acquisition of the failing TWA in early 2001, adding a ton of debt right before this storm hits. The industry was already kind of sick, and it just didn't know how sick yet. Then came a beautiful Tuesday morning on the East Coast that would turn to tragedy. At 8:46 a.m., American Airlines Flight 11 hit the North Tower, and 17 minutes later, United Airlines 175 hit the South Tower. At 9:37 a.m., American Airlines Flight 77 crashed into the Pentagon, and then at 10:03, United Airlines Flight 93 went down in a field in Shanksville, Pennsylvania. So while this is all unfolding, inside control centers and control towers around the country, but especially the Northeast, confusion was turning to horror. Controllers whose entire job was to maintain safe separation watched helplessly as transponders were turned off, making planes disappear from their screens or turn into mere primary radar blips with no real identifying information. They were using every tool that they had, but the protocols in place were designed for traditional hijackings, not these suicide bomber missions. So an important decision had to be made. So at 9:42 a.m., the National Operations Manager with the FAA, on his first day on the job, gave the unprecedented order that every single civilian aircraft in the country, over 4,500 of them at the time, has to land at the nearest possible airport. This was an order that was so drastic that there was no formal plan for it. And what followed was described as the single greatest feat in air traffic control history. This forced all of those controllers to work under unimaginable stress and guided over 2,800 planes to the ground safely in the first hour alone. By 12:16 p.m., the national airspace was clear of all civilian traffic. As I had mentioned before, the silence in the skies was absolutely deafening. But you see, on the ground, inside headquarters of every airline's airport and aviation-related business, they had the sound of a ticking clock. Despite the unspeakable tragedy that our country was going through, every single plane that was grounded was hemorrhaging money for airport fees, maintenance, staff, and the leases on the planes themselves. The revenue for that day and the coming days dropped to zero, but the costs were still coming, fast and furious. The shock was absolute. The industry wasn't just hurt. It was in a state of suspended animation, bleeding out with no idea when or if they'd be allowed to fly again. And when they did, what would that look like? The catalyst had struck, and the hidden crisis was about to explode into view. Now, as we all know, the skies finally did reopen on September 13th, and they opened for a world gripped by fear. Airports, once places of excitement, now felt a bit more like a military fortress, and the public was terrified to fly. There was more security measures in place. So with that, in the last 3 months of 2001, air travel demands had cratered by over 30%. That's not just a dip. That's close to a collapse. And no industry can survive a third of its customers disappearing overnight. Now, I am not a financial expert, but the financial carnage in this situation was immediate and it was widespread. And this wasn't just the airlines either. It was the airports and businesses associated with it. So think about passenger fees, parking, retail concessions. They all saw their revenue streams evaporate. And while we all focused on this new reality of travel, a much more desperate fight was happening in boardrooms and in Congress. So U.S. airline revenues fell from over $105 billion in 2000 to just $92 billion in 2001. And the industry lost collectively $8 billion that year. And that was the first straight year of brutal losses that would eventually top $60 billion by 2005. The problem here was simple, and that airlines had a massive fixed cost, but no customers. And with planes flying half empty, the cash burn was catastrophic. So it became pretty obvious within days that without massive government intervention, the U.S. airline industries and our airports that serve them would simply cease to exist or have significant financial burdens. So fearing a domino effect across the economy, the Bush administration and Congress moved incredibly quickly. Just 11 days after the attacks on September 22nd, the U.S. Transportation Safety and System Stabilization Act was signed into law. The act gave airlines $5 billion in direct cash to cover their losses from shutdowns, and then another $10 billion in loan guarantees to keep them from going under. But another more permanent change had to be underway. The attacks revealed catastrophic weaknesses in airport security, which at the time was handled by private contractors at most airports. In response to this, on November 19th, 2001, President Bush signed the Aviation Transportation Security Act, which created the TSA that we know today. This federal agency would take over all screening of passengers and baggage and created a new federal workforce of screeners and air marshals. Overnight, security went from being an airline responsibility to a massive federal operation, forever changing the airport experience with new rules, new technologies, and lines that were now permanent features of our travel. For our legacy carriers, though, the bailout was a Band-Aid on a gaping wound. Their bloated costs, massive debts, and rigid union contracts had been manageable in good times, and now they were an anchor dragging them to the bottom. So the first domino to fall is U.S. Airways. They were already struggling, and the attacks were a knockout blow for them. So in August 2002, they filed for Chapter 11 bankruptcy. Close behind was a behemoth of United Airlines. As one of the two airlines whose aircraft were used as weapons in these horrible attacks, they faced a crisis of public trust on top of the financial problems that already existed. When a government board rejected United's application for a $1.8 billion loan in December of 2022, their fate was sealed. 4 days later, United filed for what was then the largest airline bankruptcy in history. So at this point, the secret's out. There's a wave of bankruptcies that are coming, and it's taking down some of the titans of the industry. Delta and Northwest would soon follow in 2005. The government's lifeline had kept the planes flying, but it couldn't fix their broken business models. The decade that followed September 11th was a brutal reality check for the people who make the industry run. So while their executives navigated bankruptcy court, the lives of hundreds of thousands of employees were being dismantled. And these lives weren't limited to just the airlines. The airline numbers alone are stark. In 2000, U.S. airlines employed about 520,000 people. By 2010, that number was down to just over 378,000. That's nearly 150,000 careers, 1 out of every 4 jobs in the industry gone. For pilots, the seniority system made it particularly devastating. Thousands of pilots were furloughed, and for those who did keep their jobs, bankruptcy gave the airlines the power to slash salaries and rewrite work rules. But one of the most powerful blows was the destruction of their pension system. So for decades, the deal was pretty simple here. You work for the airlines for 30 years, you get a pretty good pension. When the post-9/11 crisis hit, these expensive pension funds just imploded. Big airlines like United and U.S. Airways argued to a judge that they can't survive while honoring these promises of pensions. So one by one, they terminated them, handing the obligation to a government agency, which has payment caps far below what many senior employees were promised. In 2005, United Airlines terminated all 4 of its employee pension plans, offloading $10 billion in promises, and it was the largest pension default in U.S. history at the time. So while a lot of focus is being paid to the major airlines and commercial aviation in that respect, there's another less visible part of aviation that's also taking a blow, and that's general aviation. And this is our world of private pilots, small planes, flight schools, and corporate jets. And immediately after the attacks, the entire fleet was grounded along with the airliners. So when flying resumes, it's under a cloud of suspicion and heavy restriction. And part of this is largely in part just to the accessibility of general aviation. So when flying does resume, it's under that cloud of scrutiny and suspicion and additional restrictions. The FAA and the newly created Department of Homeland Security established some strict no-fly zones and air defense identification zones around major cities, especially Washington, D.C. So now for thousands of private pilots flying for business or pleasure, they're now stuck on this bureaucratic nightmare. To fly within 60 miles of Washington, D.C., pilots now had to complete special training, file detailed flight plans, and maintain constant radio contact. There was a group of airports that would become known as the Maryland Three, and it's a trio of small airports that was inside the most restricted zone. They now faced impossible operating conditions. These new rules, even though they're critical for security, choked many small aviation businesses at those airports. Flight schools would lose students, your fixed-base operators, mechanics, and other businesses that would service private planes now saw their customers disappear too. So the freedom of the skies, the very essence of general aviation, was now entangled in a web of security measures and another unforeseen casualty of this new era. Now, in addition to all the problems with the major airlines and general aviation, this brutal decade of bankruptcies and security overhauls is not the end of the story here. The time that we lived in was a trial by fire in a totally new American aviation system. The way that you and I fly today is a direct result of the changes born from that crisis. One of the first and biggest things that we saw outside of the security realm was the massive wave of consolidations. The industry was still pretty fragmented and they were losing money. And they figured out it couldn't survive as it was. So the solution was mergers. Before 9/11, 9 major airlines controlled most of the market. The mergers started as the dust was settling. And in 2005, America West took over the twice bankrupt U.S. Airways. And in 2008, Delta merged with Northwest. In 2010, United merges with Continental, and the final giant piece of the puzzle fell into place in 2013 when America merged with U.S. Airways to create the world's largest airlines. So in just a few years, the old guard was gone, and now we just have the 4 major airlines, American, Delta, United, and Southwest, that control nearly 80% of our domestic market. Now, all these mergers have a huge effect on the ground as well. With fewer competitors, the remaining airlines had the power to streamline their networks. So they shut down or drastically downsized some of their former hubs in cities like Pittsburgh and St. Louis and Cleveland. Airports like Pittsburgh International, once a bustling hub for U.S. Airways with over 500 daily departures, now saw traffic plummeting and concourses boarded up. And for many smaller cities, this meant fewer flights and higher prices. These major airlines also learned a valuable lesson from their low-cost rivals. You can charge for everything. And the era of ancillary revenue had begun. Checked baggage fees now became a normal, and then came the fees to change a flight, or pick your seat, or get extra legroom, and the list goes on, and this wasn't just nickel and diming, it was a core survival strategy. The idea of squeezing every dollar out of every flight, airlines now became masters of capacity discipline. Gone were the days of flying half-empty planes. The percentages of seats filled on an average flight known as load factor crept up and up and up, leading to crowded cabins that we know today. At the same time, the security apparatus that became in place after the attacks became permanent. The TSA grew into a massive agency, developing new technologies and risk-based screening procedures like TSA PreCheck to manage the constant threats. The relationship between the FAA and the military also transformed here. So now we have direct lines of communication that were established between the FAA and NORAD, which ensures that in a future crisis, the response from fighters would be immediate and not delayed by any bureaucratic hurdles. There's also more knowledge of the Air Marshal Program, which actually existed before 9/11, but it was in very small numbers. The force before the attacks was just about 33 people, and afterwards the program expanded dramatically and moved under the Transportation Security Administration in 2003. That service would later grow to thousands of marshals during the expansions and adjusted its mission and deployment model over time. Despite the growth here, the Air Marshal Program isn't just some magic wand, and their presence reduces some risk, but does not and cannot cover every flight. Another interesting security program that came of the attacks was the Federal Flight Deck Officer Program. Now, this program deputizes screen pilots to carry firearms in the cockpit as an absolute last resort line of defense. It's a voluntary program, and it comes with some pretty rigorous vetting and training regimens. This is all administered by the TSA and their partner agencies. The program has always been relatively small compared to the entire pilot population, but it is an enduring legislative and operational result of the attacks. One of the more controversial pieces that were put in place after the attacks was some of the watch lists. So pre-9/11, airlines did their best to compare passenger lists against these ad hoc watch lists. Now, post 9/11, the federal government took over these lists and they match it with a secure flight program. Secure Flight centralized and standardized a lot of the watch list vetting and introduced some categorization and changed how the airlines and TSA would interact about passengers that were flagged for screening or denials. Privacy advocates and oversight bodies have questioned their practices, and this is one of those topics that is a little bit controversial at times, but it does remain a central tool in modern aviation security. So this is a lot of ground to cover here to talk about just the parts of the aviation industry that were significantly impacted by these attacks. And the story of the last 20 plus years in aviation is one of some pretty incredible turmoil and transformation. This is a story that many of us feel every time we fly, whether we realize it or not. And it gives you a new perspective on the forces that shape our travel. So the next time that you're standing in that long security line or paying extra baggage fees or squeezing into that middle seat, you are feeling the echoes of the attacks of September 11th. The attacks didn't just change security, they triggered a deep, agonizing financial crisis that secretly broke the old airline industry, and it sped up a partial transformation that might have taken decades. The industry that survived is in many ways more resilient and it's more profitable today. But the resilience came from monumental human price here. It was paid by the 150,000 airline workers who lost their jobs and the hundreds of thousands who saw their retirements decimated. It was paid for by private pilots and small aviation businesses that were squeezed out by new security rules. And it was paid for with the trust and loyalty that once defined a career in the skies. While the world focused on the towers and the Pentagon and a field in Pennsylvania, and on heroism and the wars that would come after, there was still a pretty significant impact to the aviation industry. Now, one thing I want to put out here as I start to wrap up is I don't want to diminish any of the tremendous loss of the attacks themselves and the wars that came after. Those are certainly some significant moments in our history. But as I discuss aviation history and the moments that impacted us pretty heavily over the years, September 11th is up there with one of the major incidents that had a huge impact on the industry and the way that we fly today. So I felt it was important to cover this as we approach the anniversary of the September 11th attacks. My final thoughts for you for this episode are this. This week marks 24 years since those unspeakable attacks on our country. So I hope that this week you'll take a moment to reflect and to remember those who lost their lives. From those who were just going to work in their office building, taking a flight somewhere in the country, to those who risked everything and sacrificed their lives to try to save others.